What if I told you that 10 plants exist that you only have to plant once in your entire life, and they'll feed you for the next 20, 30, even 40 years? What if I told you that these plants require almost no fertilizer, tolerate neglect, survive droughts and freezes, and produce more food with each passing year instead of less? And what if I told you that the reason you've never been taught about them has nothing to do with their productivity and everything to do with the fact that they make you permanently independent from seed companies, grocery stores, and the annual planting cycle that keeps you coming back for more? Today, we're walking through 10 perennial vegetables and herbs that you plant once and harvest for decades. By the end of this video, you'll understand why these plants have been quietly removed from mainstream agriculture, how to grow them, and why they represent the most radical act of food independence you can take. Let's begin. If this is your first time here, welcome. This channel exists to expose the plants that make people independent. Not trendy, not convenient for industry. Independent. We talk about plants that don't need to be replanted every spring. Plants that don't need chemicals, constant irrigation, or corporate oversight. Plants that grow stronger with age and produce more food the longer they're left alone. If that sounds like the kind of knowledge you want, subscribe now. This isn't gardening as a hobby. This is food security as an act of resistance. Let's start with the first plant on the list, and one of the most misunderstood perennial vegetables in history. Asparagus. Asparagus officinalis. A perennial vegetable that, once planted, produces edible spears for 20 to 30 years without replanting. Let that number settle. 20 to 30 years. From one planting. Asparagus is rich in folate, vitamin K, vitamin C, and glutathione, one of the most powerful antioxidants in the human body. It contains inulin, a prebiotic fiber that feeds beneficial gut bacteria. It's low in calories, high in fiber, and packed with micronutrients that support liver detoxification and cellular repair. 1 cup of asparagus provides over half your daily vitamin K, a quarter of your folate, and significant amounts of chromium, which regulates blood sugar. It takes 2 to 3 years to establish. That's the trade-off. You plant crowns in deep, well-drained soil. You wait. You don't harvest the first year. You barely harvest the second year. But by year 3, the plant is producing. And it doesn't stop. A mature asparagus bed produces for decades. In some cases, over 40 years. It tolerates cold winters. It survives drought. It requires no replanting, no reseeding, no annual input beyond compost and patience. So why isn't asparagus promoted as a food security crop? Because it doesn't fit the model. It doesn't require annual seed purchases. It doesn't need chemical fertilizers if the soil is prepared correctly. It doesn't make you dependent on any system except time. Asparagus is the opposite of annuals. It rewards long-term thinking. It rewards stability. It rewards people who plan to stay in one place and build something that lasts. And that kind of independence is not profitable. Rhubarb. Rheum rhabarbrum. A cold hardy perennial that produces tart, edible stalks for 15 to 25 years with almost no care. Rhubarb is rich in vitamin K, vitamin C, calcium, and potassium. It contains anthraquinones, compounds that support digestive health and have been studied for their laxative and anti-inflammatory properties. The stalks are edible. The leaves are toxic due to oxalic acid, but that's common knowledge in any kitchen garden. Rhubarb thrives in cold climates. It needs a winter chill to produce well. It tolerates poor soil, partial shade, and neglect. Once established, it spreads slowly through rhizomes, forming large, productive clumps that get bigger every year. You plant it once. You divide it every 5 to 10 years if you want to propagate it. Otherwise, you leave it alone. It produces in early spring, often before anything else in the garden is ready. It's one of the first fresh foods of the season. And yet rhubarb has been quietly phased out of American gardens. Why? Because it's too easy. Because it doesn't need to be replanted. Because it's a plant that, once established, produces without asking for anything in return. Rhubarb doesn't fit into the seed industry model. It doesn't fit into the annual crop cycle. It doesn't fit into a system that profits from repetition and dependency. Rhubarb is permanence, and permanence threatens business models built on scarcity. Jerusalem artichoke, Helianthus tuberosus, also called sunchoke, a native North American perennial that produces edible tubers and is nearly indestructible once planted. Jerusalem artichoke is not from Jerusalem. It's not an artichoke. It's a sunflower relative that produces knobby, potato-like tubers underground. These tubers are rich in inulin, a prebiotic fiber that feeds beneficial gut bacteria and doesn't spike blood sugar. They contain iron, potassium, and thiamine. They have a nutty, slightly sweet flavor and can be eaten raw, roasted, or fermented. And they spread aggressively. Once planted, they return every year. They tolerate poor soil, drought, and neglect. They grow up to 10 feet tall, produce bright yellow flowers, and create dense stands that crowd out weeds. In fact, Jerusalem artichoke spreads so effectively that it's been classified as invasive in some regions. Why? Because it grows without permission. Because it spreads without control. Because it represents a plant that doesn't need human management to survive. But here's the reality. Jerusalem artichoke was a staple food for indigenous peoples across North America for centuries. It was grown in European gardens as a reliable winter food source. It was productive, easy, and required no replanting. And then it was quietly removed from mainstream agriculture. Why? Because it's too independent. Because it doesn't need annual seeds. Because it doesn't fit into controlled, managed systems. Jerusalem artichoke is food security that spreads itself. And that kind of autonomy doesn't align with systems built on dependence. Lovage, Levisticum officinale, a tall, celery-flavored perennial herb that lives for decades and produces abundant edible leaves, stems, seeds, and roots. We covered lovage in the last video, but it deserves to be here because it's not just an herb. It's a perennial vegetable. Lovage tastes like celery, but stronger. You can use the leaves in soups, the stems in stir-fries, the seeds as a spice, and the roots as a cooked vegetable. The entire plant is edible. It contains volatile oils that support digestion, reduce bloating, and act as a mild diuretic. It's rich in vitamin C and quercetin, an anti-inflammatory flavonoid. It's a long-lived perennial. Once planted, it can live for 30 years or more. It grows up to 6 feet tall. It tolerates cold, heat, poor soil, and shade. It requires no fertilizer, no irrigation, and no maintenance beyond an occasional harvest. And it's almost impossible to find in grocery stores. Why? Because it doesn't fit the supply chain. Because it's too productive for too long. Because it's a plant that, once established, doesn't need to be replanted, reseeded, or repurchased. Lovage is what food independence looks like when it's not tied to annual cycles. Sorrel, Rumex acetosa, a perennial leafy green with a sharp, lemony flavor caused by high levels of vitamin C and oxalic acid. Sorrel is one of the first greens to emerge in spring. It produces continuously from early spring through late fall. It comes back stronger every year, and it lives for over a decade with minimal care. It's rich in vitamin C, iron, magnesium, and potassium. It's been used traditionally to support liver function, reduce inflammation, and improve digestion. It tolerates poor soil, partial shade, and cold winters. It self-seeds if allowed to flower. It requires no fertilizer and almost no water once established. And yet sorrel is rarely grown commercially. Why? Because it wilts quickly after harvest. Because it doesn't transport well. Because it's too easy to grow at home. Sorrel is a perfect example of a plant that's been left out of the food system, not because it lacks value, but because it offers too much value for too little cost. You plant it once. It feeds you for 10 years. It doesn't ask for anything. And that's exactly why it's been quietly removed from the conversation. Chives, Allium schenoprasum, a perennial onion relative that forms self-multiplying clumps and produces edible leaves and flowers for decades. Chives contain allicin, a sulfur compound with antibacterial and antiviral properties. They're rich in vitamin K, vitamin C, and folate. They support cardiovascular health, reduce inflammation, and improve digestion. They grow in clumps that expand every year. You can divide them every few years to propagate new plants. They tolerate cold, heat, drought, and neglect. They're one of the first plants to emerge in spring and one of the last to die back in fall. They require no replanting, no reseding, no maintenance beyond occasional division and harvest. And yet they're treated as a garnish, a decoration, an afterthought. Why? Because they're too easy. Because they don't fit into the model of annual dependence that drives the seed and agriculture industry. Chives are resilience. You plant them once, and they feed you forever. Walking onions, Allium proliferum, also called Egyptian onions or tree onions. A perennial onion that replants itself by producing bulbils at the top of its stalks. Let me repeat that. This plant replants itself. Walking onions grow like regular onions, but instead of producing flowers, they produce clusters of small bulbs at the top of tall stalks. These bulbs get heavy, bend the stalk to the ground, and root where they touch the soil. That's why they're called walking onions. They literally walk across the garden. The bulbs are edible. The stalks are edible. The underground bulbs are edible. The entire plant is food. Walking onions are rich in sulfur compounds, vitamin C, and quercetin. They have the same health benefits as regular onions, including antibacterial, anti-inflammatory, and cardiovascular support properties. They tolerate cold, poor soil, and neglect. They require no replanting because they replant themselves. They spread slowly but reliably. Once you have them forever, and they're almost entirely absent from mainstream gardening culture. Why? Because they don't need seed companies. Because they don't need human intervention. Because they represent a plant that propagates itself without oversight, permission, or management. Walking onions are autonomy in plant form. Sea kale, Crameritima, a cold-hardy perennial vegetable native to coastal Europe that produces edible shoots, leaves, and flower buds. Sea kale is related to cabbage and broccoli. It has a mild, slightly bitter flavor similar to asparagus. The young shoots are blanched and eaten like asparagus. The leaf can be cooked like kale. The flower buds can be eaten like broccoli. It's rich in vitamin C, calcium, and glucosinolates, sulfur-containing compounds with documented anti-cancer properties. Sea kale is a long-lived perennial. Once established, it can produce for 15 to 20 years. It tolerates poor soil, salt spray, cold winters, and drought. It requires almost no care beyond occasional compost and mulch. And it's almost extinct from cultivation. Why? Because it takes 2 to 3 years to establish. Because it doesn't fit into the annual crop cycle. Because it's a plant that rewards patience and long-term thinking instead of immediate gratification. Sea kale is what food security looks like when it's built on permanence instead of repetition. Plant 9. Good King Henry. 10 to 11 o'clock, Good King Henry. Blitum bonus henritus. A perennial leafy green with a spinach-like flavor that was once a staple vegetable in European gardens and is now nearly extinct from cultivation. Good King Henry is rich in iron, calcium, and vitamins A and C. It's been used traditionally as a nutritive tonic, digestive aid, and blood builder. It's a hardy perennial. Once planted, it returns every spring for decades. It tolerates cold, poor soil, shade, and neglect. The young leaves are eaten like spinach. The flower buds can be cooked like broccoli. The entire plant is edible, and it's almost impossible to find. Why? Because it doesn't fit the annual crop model. Because it's too productive for too long. Because it's a plant that, once established, doesn't need to be replanted or repurchased. Good King Henry is a perfect example of what we've lost. A perennial vegetable that was once common, productive, and reliable. And it disappeared not because it stopped working, but because it worked too well. Plant 10, perennial leeks, 11 to 12 o'clock perennial leeks. Allium ampliprasum, also called wild leeks or perennial Welsh leeks. A cold-hardy perennial that multiplies slowly through bulb division and produces edible stalks for years. Perennial leeks taste like regular leeks, but milder. They contain the same sulfur compounds. Why? Because they don't fit the seed industry model. Because they multiply slowly. Because they represent a plant that doesn't need to be replanted every year. Perennial leeks are what food security looks like when it's built on slow, steady abundance instead of fast, extractive cycles. Let's pause and talk about what all of these plants have in common. They're perennial. They live for years, decades, or even generations. They don't need to be replanted. They don't need annual seed purchases. They don't need constant inputs. They get stronger with age instead of weaker. And that's exactly why they've been quietly removed from mainstream agriculture. The modern food system is built on annuals. Annuals require seeds every year. Annuals require fertilizers, pesticides, and irrigation every year. Annuals create dependency. Annuals create profit. Perennials do the opposite. Perennials create independence. You plant them once, and they produce for decades. You don't need to buy seeds. You don't need to buy inputs. You don't need to participate in the cycle of annual dependence that drives the agriculture industry. There's no federal ban on perennials. There's no law that says you can't grow asparagus or rhubarb. But there is a cultural erasure. These plants have been left out of gardening catalogs, left out of agricultural education, left out of the public consciousness. Why? Because they don't fit the model. Because they don't create recurring revenue. Because they make people independent. And independence is the opposite of what the system needs to function. Let's talk about what happens when you plant these 10 perennials. You plant them once. You wait. You establish them. And then you harvest for decades. You stop buying seeds every spring. You stop replanting every year. You stop participating in the cycle of annual dependence that keeps you tied to seed companies, garden centers, and the industrial food system. You build soil instead of depleting it. Perennials have deep root systems that improve soil structure, sequester carbon, and support beneficial fungi. They don't require tillage. They don't require synthetic fertilizers. They don't require constant irrigation. You create micronutrient security. These plants provide vitamins, minerals, and phytonutrients that are difficult to get from processed food. They provide fresh food in early spring when nothing else is available. They provide late-season food when annuals have stopped producing. You create resilience. Perennials survive droughts, floods, and freezes. They come back every year without replanting. They produce more food the longer they're left alone. And you create something that lasts. Something that outlives trends, market crashes, and supply chain disruptions. Something that feeds not just you, but your children and possibly their children. That's what perennials represent. Not convenience. Not profit. Permanence. Perennial food systems are not theoretical. They're real. They're being used right now in food insecurity contexts, permaculture projects, and regenerative agriculture systems around the world. Organizations working in Africa, Asia, and Latin America are planting perennial vegetables to create long-term food security in regions with unreliable seed supply chains. Asparagus, Jerusalem artichoke, and perennial alliums are being used because they produce food year after year without requiring annual seed purchases. Permaculture practitioners have been documenting perennial food systems for decades. The data is clear. Perennials produce more food per unit of input than annuals. They require less water, less fertilizer, and less labor. They build soil instead of depleting it. And yet this information is almost entirely absent from mainstream agriculture education. Why? Because it doesn't align with the business model of modern agriculture. Because it creates independence instead of dependency. Because it represents a shift in power from institutions to individuals. Food prices are rising. Seed prices are rising. Fertilizer prices are rising. Supply chains are fragile. Trust in institutions is eroding. And in the middle of all of that, perennials are still producing, still growing, still offering a quiet path toward independence. The rediscovery of perennial food systems is inevitable. Not because it's trendy, Not because it's convenient, but because it works, because it makes sense, because it creates resilience in a world that's becoming less predictable every year. The people who plant perennials now are the people who will have food security 10, 20, 30 years from now. The people who share perennial plants are the people who are building networks of resilience that exist outside the system. This is not nostalgia. This is strategy. 10 plants. 10 examples of food security that lasts for decades. Asparagus, rhubarb, Jerusalem artichoke, lovage, sorrel, chives, walking onions, sea kale, good King Henry, perennial leeks. You plant them once. They produce for decades. They require almost no care. They don't need replanting. They don't need annual inputs. They get stronger with age, and they represent the most radical act of food independence you can take. Not because they're rare, not because they're difficult, but because they make you permanently independent from the cycle of annual dependence that drives the industrial food system. If you plant even one of these perennials, you've taken a step outside the system. If you share divisions or seeds, you've helped someone else do the same. If you teach others, you've created a ripple that moves in the opposite direction of dependency. That's what this channel is about. Not trends, not convenience, independence. Leave a comment if you've grown any of these plants. Leave a comment if you've had success or failure. Leave a comment if you've been told they're too difficult, too slow, or not worth it. I want to hear your experience. And if this video resonated with you, subscribe. This is just the beginning. Until next time, plant what lasts. Grow what makes you independent. And remember, the most powerful plants are the ones they don't want you to notice.